Thanks for waiting, everybody, and thanks for coming to our first Toward Resilient Futures series. Sorry about my dog. Um, this is an event co-hosted by our TSU's Emergency Management and Community Resilience Programs, EMCR, where our first speaker, Jeremy Spoon, is the director. Also, another co-hosting organization is Initiative for Community and Disaster Resilience. Initiative for Community and Disaster Resilience, ICDR, where myself, Masami Nishishiba, and another host, Hiroyuki Ito, serves as a co-director. My name is Masami Nishishiba. As I said, I am the co-director of the ICDR, as well as the department chair for the Department of Public Administration. As you can see on the screen, we will be co-hosting a series of a speaker series to introduce the people who will be teaching in our UMCR program. And Jeremy, as the director, is going to kick off the speaker series. He's going to talk more about the program, so I will skip that introduction. But briefly, I want to introduce Jeremy. Jeremy is serving as a director for EMCR, but he is also an associate professor of anthropology. He does a lot of applied research on rural and indigenous disaster recovery in Nepal. And today's talk, you will be able to hear more about his research. So without any longer introduction, I will hand this off to Jeremy. Thank you.
Thank you, Masami. Greetings, namaste, tashirale. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that Portland State University is located in the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin, Kalapuya, and other indigenous peoples of the river known as Wimal, Nichiwana, and Columbia. We are grateful to be guests on these lands. Acknowledging territory shows recognition of and respect for indigenous peoples, both past and present. Recognition and respect are essential elements of establishing healthy reciprocal relationships and developing a sense of place. This is a critical time to emphasize that humans and the environment are inextricably connected, especially during the global COVID-19 pandemic, and while wildfires, landslides, and floods threaten health and safety here in Portland and across the US West. Indigenous relationships with their ancestral lands can help folks recognize how humans and the environment are one. Let us work together to honor their lives and ancestors, their descendants, and our own heritage. Thank you. Okay, so this talk that I'm going to do today is going to be broken into various parts, and we are really excited today to be sharing with everybody our new Emergency Management and Community Resilience Program. I want to thank the Initiative for Community and Disaster Resilience at the Center for Public Service for allowing us to pair up with them in this speaker series. And I'm hoping this is the beginning of a lot more fruitful engagement between our two centers and programs. The EMCR program at Portland State was the brainchild of then Dean Percy, who is now the president of our university, going back about 3 or 4 years. And the idea was that Portland State wanted to be at the front of disaster preparedness, recovery, mitigation, and response. And at the time, it seemed that we had hazards associated with the Cascadia subduction zone to plan around. And it was a focus on long-term planning for an acute hazard that would have a large-scale impact. Since that time, and everyone who's on this message has experienced, we have gone through a public health disaster, and folks here in the US West have also experienced nearly annual wildfire vulnerability with air quality issues and associated erratic weather that could be associated with climate change. Our program is now situated to respond to these different challenges and to equip the next generation to work in this emerging field. So what we're providing, or what we're going to present today, is the basics of 3 different parts of our program. The keystone of our program is our master's. Our master's degree is an interdisciplinary degree that has 52 credits and 6 different disciplines that feed it, with a transdisciplinary philosophy. Those 6 disciplines created the core courses, and our core courses live in those home disciplines and also are part of the EMCR program. Therefore, our students get some of the best of our faculty who do applied research throughout the world, and also get to connect with Portland State's reputation for community-based research and outreach, and to be situated in position now as the city and the region are coming out of the public health disaster that we're in and dealing with the many different hazards that are in front of us. We also offer more than 100 different electives that students can take after they take the core curriculum to then personalize their degree to their interests, and it can go in a variety of different pathways for the careers that we want to train them for. Our faculty draws from expertise throughout the world. This is just a taste of both our local and global reach in our program. We especially have strength in the Pacific Rim, as well as in Asia and in the global South. But this isn't just the faculty, this is just the core faculty that feed the core courses in our program. But our partner faculty, which come from 15 different additional departments that provide those electives, their research spans even further in the world. I do want to point out that we especially have a strength in studying disaster recovery. And right now we will be coming out of this current emergency that we're in, and we will be recovering from the pandemic. And I feel Portland State is situated to communicate and express in that conversations on recovery. So our master's degree has 4 steps. The first is the core curriculum that I shared with you. Those courses come from 6 different disciplines, as I said. They have commonalities. We've workshopped the different courses together for overlaps, and we'll continue doing that to make sure our curriculum is holistic, but yet interconnected. Also, there's a focus for our faculty to connect our students to the practitioner community in their courses and to think about skills. Those are the 2 really key nexus points that we want to make sure that our students hit, is that they understand what jobs they'll be training for and what skills they need to get there. In order to do that, they then jump into the electives, which are in 2 parts, methods and field specialization. In the methods, focus on research design, evaluation, communication, and assessment, as well as quantitative, qualitative, and GIS methods according to what their interests are. And then their field specializations are further broken down into 4 different parts. In those 4 different parts, the students will then focus all their elective coursework in and build those out. Lastly, and one of the keystones of our program is the capstone. And our capstones are going to be pre-created for the students, and they will know what capstones they're in at the beginning of the program. And the goal is that they meet a community partner and make as much of a sustainable and ethical and equitable impact that they can in the community in the 2-year period that they're in our master's program. Some of those capstones will span different themes. We want to make sure we span an urban theme, a rural theme, a tribal theme, as well as an international theme. And we'll have different partnerships, such as working with local emergency management, a county, a city organization, working with a private company, working with a sovereign Native American tribe, working with an international NGO, and working with a federal agency. And so we will have these partnerships for our students, and they will be able to rank what they're interested in, and then they will be part of those capstones throughout their journey. And it'll also be key that they work in teams, which is something that we'd like to reinforce. I then want to share that we also will offer a graduate certificate, which is 5 of the core classes, and that's an amazing opportunity for students who are already enrolled in different master's and PhD programs at Portland State, or in different jobs and positions and want to do professional development, but don't have time to fully go back to school. We also offer a non-degree professional certificate, which is for community members who don't want to take graduate classes, but definitely want to have a more engaged approach to this topic. And in the professional certificate, folks pick a particular issue that they're interested in and produce a personal deliverable through a series of modules offered by core faculty and partner faculty in the EMCR program. All of the programs are conducive to one fitting into the other, meaning trying the certificate, going for the graduate certificate, and then moving to the master's. We will be online and live to the world with a website, brochure, and application as of February 1st. And we'll make decisions on admissions at the end of May and early June for a cohort in next fall. And expect this speaker series that you're seeing now to continue. And we're hoping to have it shift once we highlight all of our core faculty and build our reputation to bringing practitioners into the classroom to speak to students, putting together panel discussions of different folks that can help our students understand skills they need to get different jobs, and also to expose folks to the different issues as they emerge, since this thematic idea that we're making this master's and certificate around is constantly changing and adapting, which is one of the core themes of the program itself. So we're really excited to take the next steps in this program. And we offer you, please email me if you'd like any more information on it. Again, we'll be having students coming and starting this next fall, and an application online in the next few weeks for our master's degree and our graduate certificate. And the non-degree program is already online and can be registered for now. So that's a little bit of a taste of the EMCR program. I will be hosting the talks and giving a little spiel on EMCR throughout the speaker series. We wanted to make sure the series really highlighted the different themes, both the depth and the breadth of what our program offers, so that students, faculty, and community partners could understand what we offer and where we're coming from, and how much this degree is rooted in the idea of resilience and in different ways of getting there with a critical eye. So we're excited to be part of the community of emergency management programs, and look for us in the future. And now we're on the scene. Okay, so we're gonna change gears a little bit right now, as this is part one of our speaker series. And I thought that I would start with research that I've been a part of for the last just over 5 years in Nepal, and see what kind of lessons we can learn from rural and indigenous disaster recoveries there. I also wanted to focus on the bigger picture and scale out from this research and see what we can learn for what's applicable here or in other contexts from research like this. So I'll be sharing some guiding principles and some methodological ideas that I think are applicable in multiple contexts. And I'm hoping to leave plenty of time for questions. I want to start with acknowledging my co-authors. This is a massive study that was conducted and continues to be conducted in very, very strenuous conditions. And the folks that are involved in this have gone above and beyond to make this happen. And in no way do even the authors represent at all the number of folks who made it a reality. So I'd like to acknowledge Drew Gerke, Ram Chetri, Alyssa Rai, Umesh Basnet, Chelsea Hunter, Anudit Dewan, and Alicia Milligan for help with writing, research, collaboration, visualization, cartography, and a host of other tasks that made possible what we're going to see today. And then none of that would be possible without all the folks on the ground that helped us develop these ideas and partnerships with the community and the rapport that we were able to build. And also the feedbacks that we'll be able to give from this study in different points in the community, which you'll see me returning to. I also want to recognize the National Science Foundation for its generous support of 2 different grants that have supported this research, as well as the Portland State Institute for Sustainable Solutions. I'm going to start with a little bit of background to frame a little bit this thing that we call disaster recovery. And these ideas that I'm going to put out here are emergent in the social science of disaster literature. Some of them are from the resilience literature. I am not the originator of these ideas, but I want to make sure that I assemble them together because they're critical to understand what we were looking at in this case, which was disaster recovery. First is that disasters disproportionately impact the most vulnerable. That means the poorest. That means when you have a hierarchical system like capitalism, those in a subordinated position will often feel the impact of disasters the most. Disasters will also amplify what is already there. So if there are inequalities, they will get worse if a disaster occurs. This thing that we call disaster recovery is very dynamic. It has many dimensions and it's non-linear. And when I mean non-linear, that means you can have many different outcomes that are different. They all aren't the same. You might have 3 or 4 different negative outcomes from the recovery, not just one. So there are these non-linear dynamics, which I'm going to talk about today, that are key to think about. Recovery is a process with no specific endpoint. Recovery takes time and occurs over the short and the long term. That means this thing that when folks normally hear about something we call a disaster, you're most likely hearing about it during the relief stage. That's when you receive the media attention. That's when folks normally donate money. But the relief stage has a really short memory, and folks often forget even before the recovery begins. And real recovery that's robust, that has both tangible and intangible components thought through in it, takes time. And that time can take years, maybe even decades, depending on the vulnerabilities that made the disaster what it is. In our research, we assess recovery through what we call adaptive capacity. And our definition of adaptive capacity includes the ability and intention to recover. That's really important, that recovery is not something that's predetermined. And it's really important that folks might not want to return back to the place they were before this event happened. Recovery also varies depending on what vulnerabilities are. Vulnerabilities can be structural, like buildings and infrastructure. They could be procedural, like governance and different policies. Vulnerabilities can be about money and be associated with poverty. There are health vulnerabilities. There are a myriad of different vulnerabilities that interact with hazards to cause disasters. I want to point out the research by folks named Anthony Oliver Smith, Susanna Hoffman, AJ Foss, Roberto Barrios, Elizabeth Moreno. All of them have done wonderful work on vulnerability and resilience, and I definitely encourage you to check out those authors if you want to read more about discussions on how to define vulnerability and what are some problems with recovery and resilience as terminology. Our term of recovery recognizes that returning to pre-disaster states might not be desirable, and we therefore take into account power dynamics to understand root causes. And I want to reinforce this idea of root causes, that often recovery programs look at variables downstream rather than looking at upstream as to why they're occurring in the first place, such as why inequality, such as poverty, might cause people to have a disproportionate reaction to a disaster. We saw examples of this with Hurricane Katrina, very great examples there of structural violence because of different hierarchies within the institutional racist policies in housing that you could argue were in New Orleans, which thus caused certain communities to bear the brunt of it more than others. So now I want to take you to Nepal. 2015, April 25th, around noon, a 7.8 earthquake hit. Thankfully, that earthquake occurred on a Saturday when most school children and folks were outside of their homes and in their fields. This earthquake caused nearly 9,000 deaths. It caused 22,000 injuries and more than 700,000 damaged or destroyed buildings, crippling the infrastructure. There were 14 prioritized districts that were considered earthquake affected by the government of Nepal. But as you can see here, the impact of those earthquakes was much more far-reaching than that. I'm showing the shake intensity here. I'm also highlighting some of the areas we worked in, which I'll return to. There was more than 400 additional earthquakes and aftershocks with a magnitude over 4 within 1 year of the earthquake. So I want to reinforce that this is not just a single event. The earthquake occurred within a dynamic landscape that was consistently changing. And this acute stochastic event opened up a wound that then stayed open through the creation of landslides, through the cracks in the land, and obviously through what I'm going to show you, its impact on households, livelihoods, settlements, and just everyday lives. These earthquakes in Nepal occur roughly every 100 years. There was an earthquake in the 1930s that was roughly a similar magnitude. There were not many people within our research that remembered that original earthquake. There was another earthquake in the late 80s as well that some folks remembered. But I want to reinforce that earthquakes don't happen that often, but the cascading effects from earthquake remain, such as landslides. So if you see here in the upper left and the bottom right, these are catastrophic landslides that covered settlements. Those remain on the land and become extreme hazards when, for example, the monsoon rains come. I want to introduce to you this disaster risk management cycle so that you can understand what part of this we studied. So this cycle, according to the Natural Hazards Preparedness Center, has 4 parts: response, recovery, mitigation, and preparedness. Our research in Nepal focused on this recovery stage. That means that we allowed that whole relief stage, response stage to occur before we started. And we started our research when the National Rebuilding Program began as a marker of when national reconstruction began, and it wasn't relief that was occurring. Within recovery, notice that it's short and long term. That means that this slice of the pie, we are only looking at a little slice of that slice. And we're actually conducting research from now and for the next 5 years to understand more of that slice. So I'm saying that because understanding how long recovery takes will help to inform interventions and understanding on how to help households, individuals, and places to rebuild. So our research questions for our study were, what factors contribute to household resilience to hazards? And at what point do households transform after disasters? We utilized an integrated social and an environmental systems framework. And these frameworks are commonly used in the resilience literature. Some folks use social, environmental, and technological system. There are different ways of looking at this. The important aspect in our research is that there are dual feedbacks between humans and the environment, and that human impacts in the environment reciprocally have impacts on humans. Also, in the ethnographic literature on the anthropology of disaster, there's thick description on how people and place are intimately connected, and that you cannot talk about, especially in the conversation of Indigenous peoples, place without people without place. We also employed from the resilience literature something called the rule of hand. In the rule of hand, it's instructed that you select 3 to 5 domains consisting of multiple variables that help to describe a social and environmental system. Too many domains will make it too fuzzy, too little, and it won't explain enough. And what's key to this methodology is what is picked as those domains. So for us, we selected demographics, recovery indicators, and 5 domains of adaptive capacity to follow the rule of hand. But we did not develop all of this in a vacuum. We utilized extensive pilot and previous research to understand what variables would be appropriate to define recovery, as well as the drivers of change that interrelate with recovery, and also what demographics matter as a touchstone to better understand power dynamics, household structure, composition, etc. In addition, we looked at the literature and tried to understand how other scholars have taken this on. For our recovery indicators, we realized that they had to be multifaceted. We knew that we would only be able to look at tangible indicators of recovery in a quantitative method. So we decided to use mixed methodology, which you'll see, that utilizes quantitative and qualitative methods so we could get at both the tangible and intangible aspects of recovery, the drivers of change, and all these dynamics. For our tangible dynamics of recovery, we selected home reconstruction, an ability to return home, issues with home construction, recovery of livestock and herding practice, recovery of sale of livestock products, recovery of and access to 3 types of agricultural and horticultural fields, seed storage, and ability to work as wage labor, ability to work in tourism, access to electricity, and access to communications technology. We know this isn't everything, but it's definitely more than rebuilt house, which is an often indicator of recovery and very simplistic analyses. So we tried to look at the household infrastructure, the livelihood, the dynamics of the livelihood in the market economy, and then some aspects of infrastructure within the home and personal. For the domains of adaptive capacity, we selected hazard exposure, which is biophysical vulnerabilities such as landslide proximity and risk and impeded access to farms, pastures, forests, and firewood collection areas. Institutional context, influence of participation in the governance system and other formal and informal institutions. Livelihood diversity, role of income heterogeneity and diverse patterns of resource use, should be the end. Linkage, connectivity, linkages between households and external actors in receiving assistance and the flows of outside ideas. And social memory, prior experiences with natural hazards, and the roles of local knowledge and practice. And we took our domains of adaptive capacity and we created a model. This is how we visualize them, that hazard exposure acted upon all the different variables that interact with each other, and they all interact with each other, not just individually with each other. And that in one will show us some clues for recovery indicators. So we went out and we figured out different variables that we could use for these different domains based on the context in which we're working in. And here you can see all the different variables we selected. We ended up having 34 recovery indicators, 12 hazard exposure variables, 12 institutional participation, 73 livelihood diversity variables, because livelihoods are so complex, and adaptive connectivity had 16 and social memory had 27. This made and we additionally had 35 demographics, and that totaled 209 variables. Just as, I know this might be hard to see, but this is how we populated the model with both quantitative and qualitative data. So the light blue is quantitative data and the purple is qualitative data. And those are different inputs into how we looked at the model to understand our results in the end. So how did we pick our sites for this study? First, we selected 2 highly impacted districts, one at the epicenter and one that had the highest deaths per capita, and it was impacted from landslides. And we used the Village Development Committee as the unit of analysis, as the area that we would pick for this site selection. However, since that time, those VDCs have been collapsed into larger municipalities, but we can still use the VDCs because they, by and large, still follow the same boundaries as wards within a bigger municipality. And we've selected VDCs that had all primary homes and critical infrastructure damaged or destroyed. And we tried to pick areas that were typical. So rather than picking areas that had unbelievable catastrophic stories or really, really special stories on why things didn't happen to them, we tried to shoot for the middle so that our study would be most useful and have the broadest impact. So our selection criteria, the primary was to pick one community in each district that was accessible by road and one that was not accessible by road, to pick one with more aid, one with less aid, more that had more businesses and market integration, one that relied more on agro-pastoralism, one that had folks relocated to displacement camps, and one that had presence or absence of hydropower development. We also wanted to look at ethnic and linguistic diversity and decentralized governance, whether or not that was a factor as secondary criteria. So these are our 4 sites that we picked. At the top here in the black, you can see where they're located in Nepal. And each one of them we mapped here, and you can see the households that were randomly selected for each one, geolocated. The red on the different maps are landslides, so you can see some of the biophysical vulnerability. I'll be showing you more maps later to learn more about these places. For our methodology, we selected 3 primary methods that had multiple components each. We conducted a household survey with 400 households for a 10-week period from January to March of 2016. And then we repeated the same methodology 6 months later for 10 weeks from October to December 2016. And we were able to relocate 397 out of the 400 original households, which is an unbelievable feat. And I want to thank all of our research collaborators for that and for cell phones. We then completed in-depth interviews with 40 individuals during the first research phase. And in the second phase, we did 8 focus groups. And the household survey had both quantitative and qualitative questions. The qualitative questions were follow-up questions based on the quantitative survey. And for the qualitative methods, we were looking at the impacts of the earthquake, worries, hopes, challenges, and threats, perceptions of hazard risk, role of institutions in recovery, role of local perspectives in recovery, livelihood impacts and transitions, perception of government and outside aid, role of local knowledge in recovery, and emergence of new opportunities. We then, throughout the study, reconnected with the community and fed our research back, which is a key component of all the work that we do. So at 9 months, we started the study. At 1.5 years, we returned the research from the first phase. And then we conducted research return workshops at the end, 8 total. And we did these with the newly elected local government officials as part of the decentralization effort that Nepal is going through to empower local communities to make more decisions themselves. And we worked with those local leaders to share our results with their constituents. We also brought them to Kathmandu to speak on behalf of their communities to NGOs, academics, and representatives from the government. So as part of our work, we have a high focus on training and outreach, and the ethics associated with what I'm going to explain, I think, are transferable to any context. First, we recruited senior technical advisors, project coordinators, and research assistants with interest in personal investment in the project. These were all Nepali folks, mostly indigenous, that were impacted by the earthquake, newly received degrees from Tribhuvan University, our partner institution, and worked with Resources Himalaya, another one of our partner institutions. We then conducted training workshops for the research team on ethics theory and methods related to the project. So we had the opportunity to take folks with social science and ecological training and mix it together in a personalized methodology for our work. We carried out multiple large community meetings in each selected VDC to introduce the project, present preliminary results, and solicit feedback at the onset of phases 1 and 2. We did 24 of those meetings. And we conducted local and national research return workshops with newly elected board representatives, government agencies, INGOs, NGOs, and applied academics to triangulate results and provide contextualization. So here's some photos of us working together in the training modules. And here are some of our first phase 1 community outreach when we shared what the project was all about before collecting any data and doing some information sharing and awareness building. It's also very interesting for each community to learn about one another and their challenges. And this was a training of the trainers where we had the staff from phase 1 training the staff of phase 2 in the full methodology. And these are phase 2 research return workshops from phase 1. You can see in the background these flex banners that have descriptive statistics and photos, and we're trying our best to have the information shared. And these are our community level workshops. These are banners that we made to help folks remember the research when we did our research return workshops in places without electricity so that we could share about the research and talk about the different locations. And then these are the research return workshops where we provided a summary of the research, contact information, and worked with the new locally elected governments. And this is from our international workshop that we had in Kathmandu, where we brought the local governments to collaborate with them, to speak with the NGOs, to speak to the government, to speak to the missionaries, and speak on their own behalf. I'm even in this picture. Also, we continued our outreach, which is going on right now. We participated in the Nepal Reconstruction Authority International Symposium on Nepal's Reconstruction in August of this year, and are part of a special issue in a journal as well as a national publication to share our results to policymakers and different community members and other interested parties. Okay, so I want to take us to our different locations and talk a little bit about our research and what we found and how it's applicable to Portland, the Pacific Northwest and Cascadia. So the first community that we worked in is Aru Chinote. This map is showing you many things. What you're seeing in it are the geolocated households. You're also seeing an inundation zone of a dam that's planned to be built, the Budogandaki Dam. So some of the households in our study, as well as some of the infrastructure, is going to be underwater in the next 5 to 10 years. You can see how the infrastructure got impacted by the color of what it is. Remember, all the households were damaged or destroyed. Those are gray. And this is the largest and most densely populated area we worked in. And there's a small bazaar market area down here, and then a more rural agrarian agro-pastoral lives going on in the northern part. This is Kashigao. It's a 2 to 3 day walk from the end of the road. The road ends in Aruchinote, and then the walk to Kashigao. So Kashigao is only accessible on foot. And here you can see it's broken up into 3 different settlements that had catastrophic damage by the earthquakes, as well as surrounded by landslides. So a lot of biophysical vulnerability. We went through at least 2 earthquakes while collecting the data in the village here. It was a highly biophysically marginal and had extreme impacts. Galang is a settlement that's at the end of another road, takes 12 hours from Kathmandu. Arugat, or Aruchinote, the first site, takes also 12 to 14 hours from Kathmandu. You actually have to drive through Langtang National Park and pay the admissions for the park to get to this community, which is a contested problem for some. And here the road goes to 2 different settlements, Gatlang and Gray, that you're seeing here. And in these areas, there's a small tourism industry. It's more pastoralism than it is farming, whereas the other community is much more balanced in its farming and herding. This community is primarily Buddhist, although there is some conversion to Christianity happening. In this community, I forgot to tell everyone, we also had primarily Buddhists and some conversion to Christianity. And this community is heterogeneous with Buddhists, Hindus, and Christians. We found that there was an increase in conversion to Christianity after the earthquake, so that's why I bring it up. This is our final area, Haku. This area had the most catastrophic impacts from the earthquakes because of landslides. Those photos that I showed you are from there. And here you can see multiple settlements, Naishing, Sanohaku, Tuluhaku, Haku Basi, catastrophic damage to pretty much everything. And this area is a 1 to 2 day walk from Gatlang, not accessible by road. And in with this community, we had 64 households that were relocated to displacement camps. So lastly, the displacement camps, which are on this pullout map here, they were all south of this area, and there were 7 of them. And I want you to keep that in mind. So there's these different places, Tiru, Gogane, and Haku Basi, that were all part of areas that are here in in Haku, that were relocated to areas that they're not from at a lower elevation and broken up into groups. And that's very important to remember. These are some of the landslides that hit Haku. These are actually the lessons that were on the school board from the Friday before that this school got hit by the earthquake in the bottom right. And in the bottom left here, you have the catastrophic near landslide dam outburst flood, where a landslide hit the river here and almost blocked it up. And the road that was on this side of the river was actually created to build a dam. And some theorize that the blasting to create that road made that area more vulnerable to these landslides. And there's some research that reinforces that from other locations. And then life in the displacement camps was very difficult, sponsored by international organizations, very, very densely populated, not a lot of opportunities to get out. Life goes on, people farm there, people create livelihood there, they do, folks do ceremony there, but it's a hard life. The gentleman on the right asked to be part of the presentations. His whole family was impacted by landslides in Haku, and he's been relocated to this area. He had deaths in his family. His injuries are from this earthquake. And talk about resilience. This gentleman now is living back home in the settlement. Okay, so I'm now going to share with you our results and our lessons learned, and go through a little bit of the methodology that we used that I think might be useful for folks to think about, and take a moment to kind of delve your way into this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you the quantitative results, the qualitative results, and then I'm also going to delve you in a little deeper through ethnography to bring some themes to life so that you can really kind of experience what I'm saying. So just to give you a basic idea, folks that participated in the survey were largely in their 40s. We had pretty much an even ratio, male to female. The survey could be done by any household member over the age of 18. So it's great that we had such a great even ratio. Our sample was about 62% Buddhist and 21% Hindu and 15% Christian, and was various indigenous ethnic groups in Nepal, about 93% indigenous and 7% Brahmin and Chetri. Those are folks who've migrated into these areas for different reasons, mostly commerce. So within our sample of 400 households, 81.7% were destroyed and 18.3% were damaged. At 9 months after the earthquakes, only 1% of our sample were able to return to their houses. I want you to wrap your heads around that. That means 99% of our sample were living in CGI corrugated tin houses with dirt floors, waiting to rebuild homes, to figure out what the next steps are, couldn't go back to their home because of how much damage and how dangerous it was. At a year and a half, you see about 44% of our sample was able to go to their original homes. But this is all over the board. I want you to notice that 92% were able to get home in one community and only 8% in another. And what's interesting here is that Kashigao is one of the inaccessible settlements that's a couple days walk from the road, whereas Gatlang's at the end of the road. So what's going on there? You'd think Gatlang would have been in their homes faster. I also want to show that issues folks had with rebuilding got worse as time continued. So at 9 months, about 55% of the households were saying they were having issues rebuilding. At a year and a half, 92% said it. And it's because of a compound level of factors. One is they started the National Rebuilding Program and it wasn't working for them. Two is they were vulnerable because they were in temporary shelters to a bunch of different impacts, such as extreme weather and landslides. And so more things happened after the disaster, a disaster after the disaster. So for our data analysis, we selected 2 techniques. For the quantitative, we picked non-metric multidimensional scaling ordination. This is not a common tool used in disaster research, and it's actually much more common in ecology. And we decided to use it because of the number of variables in our model. It made the most sense to us that we would want a technique that would help show the similarities and differences between how the different households responded to our surveys so that we could look for patterns, rather than making any assumptions or having to create an index. So instead, this technique allows you to look at multiple independent and multiple dependent variables and have those put into different configurations without that affecting the actual output, because the multiple regressions that are conducted are individual between each independent and each dependent variable. So it's a really exciting method for social scientists or other types of inductive researchers, because it allows you to look for a pattern rather than trying to prove or test a hypothesis per se. Instead, you get to kind of assemble the story together through this methodology and then delve into it with other methods to try and understand what's happening. So for us, this suite of methods worked. In another context, another multivariate technique might be better, or maybe not using the same methods at all. So what you're seeing now is an ordination using NMS, non-metric multidimensional scaling. So what you're seeing is each household is a dot, and each household's dot represents all of their responses for the 34 recovery indicators that we selected. And what this test does is it shows a dissimilarity index, or it has a dissimilarity index that gives a XY coordinate for how similar and different the entire suite of responses to those 34 indicators. And in this case, what you're looking at is over 2 time periods put together so that we can understand what the strongest associations are. So how we do that is you first have the ordination, which is all the colored dots that you're looking at. You're probably mad at me right now because it's giving you a headache. And then these different, the 1, 2, 3, 4 that you see on here, each represent the locations. And those are centroids that are giving the average result, the average coordinate for all the people that live in that area. And so you're seeing there's a little bit of a pattern there. Also, what we do next in this method is something that we call surface fitting or vector fitting. And what vector fitting does, it allows us to try and understand what this axis 1 and axis 2 mean. And those are 2 different dimensions of recovery. And by understanding where the different variables have the strongest associations, we can then learn what the axes mean. Once we know what the axes mean, we then can interpret what the position of the household in the XY plane means. We'll call that the recovery space. So to help us here, I put in each quadrant which variables had the strongest associations, and those are represented by these lines. And here you'll see that all the negative stuff that could happen to you happens on the left side of the x-axis here, right? On the negative side. Impacts to your livestock health, impacts in your ability to keep your livestock, impacts in your ability to work in tourism, lost livestock, impacts in selling your products, impacts to your fields, and impacts to seed storage. Over here on the right, we've got the good stuff. Able to return to your house, you got your internet back, no earthquake impacts on selling your products, and these are all no impacts to all those different factors. So by us understanding where the strongest associations are, and then looking at where the average position is of each one of the areas we worked in, we can then better understand what their recovery is like, and also what the axes mean. So what we interpreted the axes to mean is that the x-axis, or axis 1, is negative recovery indicators and positive recovery indicators. And then this y-axis really speaks to displacement. So the folks that are down here, you see how it's number 4? Those are all the folks in the displacement camps, but it's also folks displaced from their homes and agro-pastoral livelihoods. So the folks living over here are living near their houses. They are trying to get their herding and farming back together again. The people living in quadrant 3, they're stuck. They are totally static and are unable to continue their lives. So through this graph that you're looking at, we have a map of the recovery indicators. So this is showing you those 34 different variables. Another advantage to this method is that it helps you look at nonlinearity. Okay, so nonlinearity in this case means that folks might have different negative recovery outcomes. So here's one of our variables, which is high impacts to non-irrigated fields. And when we look at this, you can see on the right that the lines are perpendicular, which indicates a linear relationship. But on the left here, they're not. And they all look almost like a topographic map. The folks here on the right, they're not having a problem with their BARI. The folks here on their left, they are, but the folks here in quadrant 1 are having a different experience than quadrant 3. And what you're seeing is these are the people that are still in the villages, and these are the people that are in the camps. So they're both having a different experience in relation to this variable. You wouldn't normally be able to see that in some statistical tests that don't look at nonlinearity. We can also look at change over time. So now instead of fuzzing both phases together, we give each household 2 points, and we look at where they were in phase 1 and phase 2. So here we can see that location 1 didn't change its position much. It started in the best position and improved slightly, but not a lot. So what's going on there? For location 2, pretty bad starting point, but things seem to be getting a little better. For location 3, things started better, but seemed to be getting worse. And for phase 4, folks started in one place and stayed there, but were becoming more back on the land from being displaced, which is what you're seeing in a vertical rise there. The lesson here is that where a household or a settlement starts in the recovery might not be where they end up. And that's why it's important to look at the short and long term. I also want to show you what this method can do. If you just look at one location here at the top, this is 2 dots for each household of the 100 from Arutanote, and you can generally see that where they're heading, which is basically staying in quadrant 1. And then to understand where they go from phase 1 to phase 2, we put the origin at 0, 0, and now you can see what directions they're heading in this space. Here you can see it for Gatlong, and you can see where in location 3, people are heading in this negative direction, which shows that something is getting worse for them while they're still on the land. Remember, because this is displacement down there. The next thing that you can do with vector fitting is that you can overlay additional variables on top of the original ordination and look for correlations. So here I'm going to show you a few of what we call overlays. These are our 34 different demographics. And here what we found that households in Kashigao, in the camps, from Haku, Buddhists and Tamangs were having the worst outcomes. And folks from location 1, Hindus, Nuars, accessible and literate households and homeowners were having the better outcomes. Here, when we overlaid hazard exposure, there were really negative outcomes for folks over here in quadrant 1 for their grazing areas, their firewood access, and and threatening from landslides because they're still in their villages. And down here, as you can see, we have impacts. They seem to all be going towards getting back on the land, but we have unbelievably catastrophic impacts to grazing areas and forests and landslide vulnerability because those are the folks that are in the camps. And over here, again, you have the positive things where there's no impact. Same pattern. Here with livelihood diversity, we have a similar pattern where folks that are in the villages are having issues with their existing livestock, and then having folks that are in the camps having catastrophic impacts to the number of acres of farming land they have and the numbers of livestock that they have individually. So I'm going to share with you, I'm sure that's all in your head right now. We did that for every domain of adaptive capacity and the demographics as well to better understand what our results were, and then paired it with our qualitative analysis, which I'll share. So for our results, we looked at R squares that had a greater than 0.05, which for NMS is considered a strong correlation because there's so many variables. Those were folks from traditionally lower caste ethnic groups or religions in Nepal. And this brings up some aspects of structural violence and social inequality that those that were already in a negative position, things got worse for them. Severe hazard exposure, agropastoral livelihoods, and displacement were all variables that had the strongest associations with negative recovery. The strongest associations with positive recovery were for irrigated farmers, folks with businesses, and literate households. Strongest associations with less displacement. So folks that were less displaced from the land were folks that operationalized cultural aspects like work exchange, bigger household sizes, and homeowners. Folks that knew and utilized Indigenous and local knowledge related to architecture, as well as those that used new ideas, also had less displacement. And then our qualitative analysis found that there was strong evidence of social and spatial inequity in our research, that place attachment, uncertainty, and mental well-being were interconnected, and that the reconstruction program from the government was slow, confusing, and the funds were extremely hard to access. This is our qualitative analysis and the code groups that we use and the definitions for them. I don't have time for this, but I want to make sure that it's clear that we elevated the qualitative analysis with the same authority as the quantitative analysis, because there's elements of the qualitative that we weren't able to look at in the quantitative analysis. We also, in our research return workshops, before we interpreted our results completely, had our results validated by the community, and learned that folks felt the reconstruction program was inadequate, the building codes were inappropriate, and that they were using the money to build very small houses. Folks felt that the cascading effects from the earthquakes were making things worse, and that the future was considered really uncertain. All locations considered accessibility to be a driving factor in getting building materials and not paying additional costs to transport to inaccessible areas. This means the government gave everyone the same amount of money, but didn't take into account that some of it needed to be walked 3 days up the Himalayas. All locations felt that the National Reconstruction Authority should do more than assess damage to homes, such as helping to control future landslides. The NRA really didn't look at much more than rebuilding infrastructure. Livelihoods were not considered for at least a year, if not 2, within their reconstruction program. All locations considered INGO and NGO assistance as not sustainable, and it was looked at as only short-term relief and is comparable to giving a fish without a net. So for this work, we would layer together or assemble or braid together the quantitative and qualitative information. This is just an example of how we did it for the inequality theme of structural violence and spatial inequalities. But we wanted our research to really show the robustness of mixed methods and make sure that the tangible and intangible aspects, so tangible aspects, really clear aspects to livelihood, displacement, infrastructure, but intangible aspects like mental health and social inequality are taken into account. So here are some conclusions and lessons that we learned. For demographics and accessibility, the earthquakes were indeed a focusing event where the poorest and most marginal felt the most. Access influenced restoring agropastoralism and rebuilding decisions, but accessibility wasn't necessarily the best thing. At times, accessibility was a trap. The community that was not back in their homes by a year and a half after the earthquake were waiting for help from the road and waiting for help from non-governmental organizations rather than rebuilding their homes themselves, like some of the inaccessible settlements were at. There was also a promise that the road brings a higher standard of living, like concrete instead of wood from the forest. For hazard exposure, we found high evidence of impeded access to pastured fields and forests, landslide vulnerability, and a perceived risk of danger. For livelihoods, herders, non-irrigated farmers had it the hardest, and irrigated farmers and businesses had it less hard. And livelihood diversity was key, meaning not all your eggs in one basket. The herders, folks that only had one vocation, had a really hard time bouncing back rather than having multiple ways of getting on farming, herding, and maybe a small business. For displacement, it influenced recovery outcomes and rates and made people feel like outsiders in camps and created some prejudices and inequities. The government relief and reconstruction program and outside aid was slow, insufficient, and limited in scope. More aid did not mean the best outcomes, and some of them were highly unsustainable. The housing designs and building codes did not reflect traditional architecture, and traditional architecture helped in recovery rate and could have taken that into account. Some of the building codes hindered local innovations and caused people to not want to invest. Mental well-being, cooperation, and work exchange. We found strong place attachment to folks' ancestral settlements, key for Indigenous peoples. We found new social constructions of what folks called tension, madness, or other mental health problems associated with the earthquake. We saw a work exchange be revived as a safety net for the poorest and most marginal and inaccessible communities. And we saw some evidence of transformations in everyday life in the short term that could be because of relocation of hazard exposure, changes in livelihood, and a bunch of other things that might have put folks on different trajectories. We also saw new skills being learned and earthquake safe structure knowledge being communicating throughout communities. So now quickly, I just want to focus on a few different interrelations that are related to the theme of this talk. Rural and Indigenous lifeways, structural violence and spatial inequalities, and hazard exposure, livelihood, and displacement. In Nepal, there's been a history of structural violence against some Indigenous peoples as a result of the Muluki Ain caste system, which designated certain Indigenous peoples as alcohol drinkers, enslavable, and untouchable. The Tamangs and Dalits in our studies are examples of these peoples. These folks were completely removed from abilities to be part of the national economy in Nepal and were kept in the positions that they were in through tax collecting, rent, and labor. And because of that, you have certain ethnic groups that lived in really perilous locations. And to live in those perilous locations, you need to be able to be adaptive and have a lot of ingenuity and have a creative way of living. So because of that, we have had Indigenous peoples who've developed Indigenous knowledge in places that are on the margins. And that knowledge actually helps people to recover. But even though it might look like those areas got hit the hardest, it mitigates the disasters because of that adaptation. But the reason why some of these people live on those margins is a component of structural violence that the earthquakes magnified. So they were in a biophysically vulnerable place because of social reasons and power dynamics. So that's very important to keep in mind when thinking about how a particular disaster might affect particular peoples. Now, to live in those areas, you need to adapt your livelihood to what it's like to live on the Himalayan margins, which means you need to herd, farm, collect forest products, potentially have a small business, in the past involved in trade. And that makes you have a lot of hazard exposure. In this photo, these are folks collecting fodder for their livestock, and they're crossing an active landslide caused by the earthquake 2 years before. That's now a feature in the landscape. So these folks are mixing together their perilous location to their livelihoods to some of the violence that's been repeatedly committed against their culture because of their social positioning within the caste system. So this is what it was like for the Gatlan community when they went through a windstorm while they were still living in their tents. So this is nobody's back in their houses, a 70-mile-an-hour windstorm, all the roofs get blown off their houses, and this is because they're waiting for help from the road. So a disaster feeding another vulnerability. And there's just so much people had to deal with I don't have time to go into, but cracks and landslides and the fear of returning to these fields, fields going fallow, all kinds of grazing land being cut majorly, agricultural land being cut, subduction in terrace sets of agriculture enough that folks are it's too dangerous to farm there. Also in the camps, there's a ton of different issues that folks go through. And one of them, I want to read this quote of what it was like for an individual feeling out of place in camps. If the earthquake had not come, we would not live by doing farm work and raising cattle. We would have sent our children to school. But now we're not in a condition to go back to our village. We don't have our village in our place. Since we are living in others' place, we have to leave any time if they ask us to leave this place. Now we have to become like a crazy person walking in the street. Folks in the camps had to pay rent often to be in these camps, and were living at elevations where their local knowledge may have not been adequate. And we actually saw folks using pesticides as evidence of changing from organic agriculture in that situation. Some of the cultural tropes I want to bring out within that nexus of structural violence, indigenous lifeways, and place-based livelihoods is mutual aid, and these are and the role of indigenous knowledge. So within the area in which we work, the inaccessible areas transformed their cultural tradition of work exchange for the poorest and most marginal, and rebuilt their houses together using non-skilled labor locally. So what you're looking at here are participants in the study, neighbors, all co-rebuilding a miniature house to the new building codes in 2017. So this is 2.5 years after the earthquake. And it's fundamental to see here that this cultural kind of safety net was operationalized when folks needed it. And now I know it's not being used today. So it came in as a safety net. And other communities in Haku also used these traditions of work exchange for this. Also, it was indigenous knowledge related to farming and related to herding and related to forest product harvest and to architecture that allowed people in Kashigao, this village you're looking at, that had 92% back in their homes within a year and a half, to continue their lives, to mitigate the impacts of the earthquake, and to move in a positive direction. Another aspect of social capital we saw were family and friends giving no interest loans, which were 73% of our sample. We also saw cultural traditions being changed to help the community together as a group and have resilience for the community to recover from landslides in their village. These are folks in Haku caroling a new song they created during the Tihar holiday about how their community got impacted by the landslides to collect money to repair them. Also in our study, we did find evidence that just because there's a lot of aid doesn't mean the aid works. And also just because there's a road, it doesn't mean that folks are gonna recover faster. And we saw this as evidenced in a community that had a lot of aid that did not return to their homes quickly. I also want to point out that aid goes away very quickly after a disaster. As you can see here, the relief phase, you have a large input of funds, and then at a year and a half, it totally tailed off. Super common within the literature. Here's Gatlang at 2.5 years after the earthquake, just starting to rebuild some houses that were also bringing out class differences with folks who could build with cement and rather than build with wood, which was changing the aesthetic of the village, which was one of the tourist draws originally for the area. So aid in general was considered extremely short-term and unsustainable. Lastly, the dam construction was considered to be catastrophic and caught people in a liminal state. And some folks felt that the dam construction in Arugat was like another earthquake for them and caused them not to want to rebuild and to have their house just loosely repaired. Lastly, we saw strong associations between indigenous peoples and local peoples with place attachment, uncertainty towards the future, and mental well-being. So this idea that people have a high, strong attachment to the place they're from, so being separated and broken out into groups might not be something that is adequate for recovery. I'll read this. Now with the resettlement in a new place, I may have a new house, but it will be difficult to continue the kind of social and cultural life and its ethos we used to have in the village. Uncertainty as connected to place attachment has also been shown to give mental health issues, cause folks to not know what to do next, which I'm sure everybody can feel right now because we're in a time of uncertainty during COVID. And lastly, for indigenous and rural peoples, significant impacts on mental well-being. These folks consider the land to be part of who they are. Their stories, songs, and spiritual traditions are interwoven into the land, and it's the land that also caused this natural disaster. Maybe not the vulnerabilities, but the land. And that causes some dissonance that leads to things like re-traumatization when people see the landslides daily, which may turn into PTSD later on down the line. So we have some open access publications if you want to learn more in World Development and the International Journal of Disaster Risk Reduction, and have more coming. Our next steps are to continue this research on long-term recovery over the next 5 to 10 years. We're conducting a 10-year assessment on the built environment and decisions that people made in that area for recovery. We're going to continue our collaboration with government, the aid community, and the local community to help with interventions and work with other studies and create opportunities to adjust our model to different contexts. We have funding generously from NSF for phase 2 from this, so please look out for us on the scene to study these dynamics over the long term. Okay, so I know I've talked a ton today. I guess I'm gonna say I can get out of that because we had 2 talks, not 1. But quickly, I wanna bring this home to everybody on what the relevance of this research is to the Cascadia region and how you can apply some of this, what we learned in this study to this area. And I'm gonna explain it through these points: guiding principles, outreach, method, pre-disaster results, research on vulnerabilities, and remembering that one size doesn't fit all for disaster relief and recovery interventions. For guiding principles, consider how power and history shape our current realities by identifying root causes. In our study, a root cause is the structural violence caused by the caste system, which then interacted with where people live, which then caused them to have really extreme impacts from the earthquake. Consider relief as different from recovery. Remember that after you gave that money through that text message, that did not fix the problem. It goes on for a long time. Consider recovery as a process with no specific endpoint and that it occurs over the short and the long term. Consider recovery as tangible and intangible. And consider both where a household starts in the recovery and where they are headed, because our study showed that even if you had a better starting position, things might actually get worse before they get better. Remember that culture, livelihood, and place matter when looking at relief, recovery, mitigation, and preparedness. For outreach, conduct outreach and rapport building throughout any process of research. Conduct pilot studies to ensure site and variable selection as well as analytic techniques are appropriate. Integrate research return as primary method before interpretation of final results. Make sure your work is accessible to multiple audiences and diverse forums. And foster relationships with participants and stakeholders after the study is completed. For methodology, don't take the easy way out to define recovery indicators and drivers of change. Utilize multiple inputs to select domains and variables. We use previous experience, pilot studies, and literature. Recognize that disaster is multidimensional and changing over time. Utilize the rule of hand to identify key domains of system function. The model domains of adaptive capacity from this research could be replicated if appropriate. Employ mixed methods to ensure an appropriate research universe, such as tangible and intangible dynamics, and opportunities for triangulation. Select data analysis techniques appropriate for each context. Pre-disaster research on vulnerabilities, which would be done in the mitigation part of the pie. Identify sensitive and vulnerable points in the system. Recognize trends of amplification of recognize the trend of amplification of pre-existing power dynamics when disaster occurs. Utilize research as an opportunity for awareness raising and partnership building. So here we are at the bridge of how do we take into account Indigenous and local knowledge? How do we take into account the best new ideas to approach wicked problems in the world, like catastrophic earthquakes that occur when folks have really, really extreme vulnerabilities? And we need to think about different knowledges and different ways of the thinking of the future so that we can help to contextualize and navigate disaster recoveries, and that our interventions are well informed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeremy. It was a very interesting presentation. I am Hiro Ito. I'm the chair of the economics department, and I am also a co-director of ICDR, which is one of the organizations that organized today's event. So my role is to control the traffic of Q&A. So I have half a dozen questions in front of me, so maybe I can start asking these questions first. Then you can send me questions as well. So the first question is, it would be interesting to know more about what relationship EMCR has with the persona of existing emergency response and community resilience programs and agencies, such as Portland Bureau of Emergency Management, Multnomah County Emergency Operations, the State Office of Emergency Management, and Regional Disaster Preparedness Organization, to name a few. It would be also interesting to know how the PhD program relates to existing programs at University of Portland, PCC, and others. Is this the only master's degree, for example? Okay. Maybe, yeah, Jeremy, could you answer this question?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for asking it. The EMCR program is going to have partnerships at different scales. And so those different entities that were mentioned, some of them will be like keystone partners as we roll out our program through our capstones and our speaker series. Portland State, for example, has a wonderful relationship with the Portland Bureau of Emergency Management. We've already been in conversation about opportunities, but we've also had conversations with the Port of Portland. We will have conversations at the state level, university level, across different universities' emergency management programs. So initially our hope is that we connect to the community through our curriculum, through our students doing applied research in their capstones and teams, and then through our kind of image in the community through our participation in different groups. Because we're so new, we're not part of all the different entities yet. Our focus was to get the curriculum online and everything united. And we'll be spending this winter and spring looking at how we can partner with different programs, tribes, agencies, and create a Friends of EMCR universe that I hope all of you would like to be part of and continue to engage in our program. Our hope is that we're training the next generation of employees for all those institutions and that they can have input into our programs through an advisory capacity, which we'll develop also in the future. But I will say that we're distinctive in that our degree has a focus on emergency management and community resilience, and we're one of the only programs in the country with that focus.
Great, thanks very much. So the next question, what can describe as major changes from the governments in the regions as to doing better things that benefit the diversity of the local communities?
Great question. Those are the same challenges that we communicated back to the National Reconstruction Authority ourselves. And they definitely had a one-size-fits-all plan for the reconstruction. The housing designs were created in Kathmandu Valley with international assistance. They were not integrated as much as they could have been with local topography, lifeways, and the costs of living in alpine geographies. So the government could have done a better job with the needs assessments in each area that they did to understand what damage was done, to take into account some of the heterogeneities that we pointed out in our study. They could have taken into account livelihoods. They didn't. They mostly just took into account the house and the infrastructure. So I feel they left the rest of the work to the NGOs. And the way that the NGOs serve Nepal, anyone who's on there knows, is extremely heterogeneous, inequitable, and not something to be relied on. And it's not well organized. So that means some communities were served better than others. So I think that the government could do a better job working with the aid community, applied academics. They could do more things like the research symposium that they held to try and have the best ideas integrated in these difficult situations, because health and safety is always the first priority, and I'm not contradicting that, but the sustainability of the recovery and the decisions needs to take into account these other factors, or we're just looking at the built environment.
Great, thank you. You mentioned at the beginning that road construction itself may have been at least partially responsible for landslides. Can you more talk about this? It's interesting that this modernization effort may actually directly cause disasters.
I was also very surprised when I learned about this. I think part of the problem was the road that was constructed was a temporary road to be utilized to build a dam. Therefore, the same care that's put into a road that would be used for regular domestic transportation wasn't taken. Also, the decision to build the road there in the first place was probably taken because it was for the dam construction and never would have been built there for people because it wasn't safe. So the interaction between the slope of where they built that road and the blasting for the road, it does make a lot of sense that it would destabilize the slopes. There's no research in Nepal on that, but there's research in other areas that blasting for roads helped to destabilize slopes that caused landslides when an earthquake occurred. So I worry that that's what happened there, and it permanently transformed the landscape, and it permanently relocated 3 different communities that were in camps for up to 2.5 years. And some of those folks never got to come home.
Great. Next question. Where can I learn more about how to perform no-metric multidimensional scaling? How steep is the learning curve? Is there specialized software available to do it?
Well, whoever asked that question, I hope you're in Oregon, because the father of, or one of the foreparents of NMDS is at Oregon State, Bruce McCune. And the software PC-ORD is the software that he created. That is the software that we utilized in the research. And I don't think the learning curve is that steep. You would definitely want to talk to my collaborator, Drew Gerke, on how it went for him. We did have a little bit of an issue on how to show time in it, since most of the research in the past did not look at change over time. So we're actually excited to contribute to the research on NMS in general, and to how to use it to look at multiple independent and dependent variables over time and have this rather inductive empirical method.
Thank you.
So Oregon State, sorry, Bruce McCune is at Oregon State right here. So please send him an email, and he can blame me for the traffic of the email.
Okay, great. So the next question is, what is the role the international organizations played in the recovery effort in each community? Were they most welcome, or was there any resistance from the community? Did the responses vary by the 4 communities you studied?
Okay, so the important thing to remember is in the research design, we picked 2 different communities that didn't have that much aid before the earthquakes. And then we picked 2 that had more. So we already had an unequal amount of treatment by international organizations as an overlay in the research, which then had the inaccessible areas doing more of some of the things the nonprofits were coming in and helping with. I wouldn't say there was a negative reception to international agencies. I think that people are frustrated with the one-size-fits-all mentality. I think that parachuting in an agency that's never worked in an area, that's only there for the relief phase and is only giving out small amounts of money, food, helping with shelter, that's all in the relief stage. People, especially indigenous and rural peoples, largely health and safety and shelter, there's knowledge there for them in the lands in which they live on that they can draw on for some of that. But the long-term perspective, it seemed nobody took. And that these, larger INGOs that, maybe could have had, they had like a huge impact in a village, like rebuilt a lot of things and then leave, how unsustainable that is for people to restart their lives. So it just I think communities felt like there was a disjoint culturally between them and these organizations. I think it felt like they were being looked at as victims, not as survivors. I think that they were maybe slightly dehumanized. And I also think these organizations are heavily taxed and overburdened. And so it's a very difficult interaction between the service providers and the survivors. And actually the service providers become survivors because of what they experience in being those first responders also. So I'd say it's mixed. Nepal has a very unique history in terms of colonialism and relationship with the West, and an attitude there generally positive towards external assistance. Nepal, one of the largest aspects in the Nepali economy is the aid economy, in addition to the remittance economies. So the aid, it's a trope that wasn't new, even though there is something called disaster capitalism that's very real, where the aid kind of balloons up when one of these events happens, and there's a lot of commerce and contracts and things that go on, and people, a lot of money is exchanged, and some of it, maybe Haiti being one of the most amplified examples, is not good.
Okay, well, because of the time constraint, why don't we have just one more question, which is the following. Where can current undergraduates find more information on the new masters, as well as the information for folks looking for the professional certificate? Probably the good question to ask as the last question.
What a great last question. Yeah. So as I said, February 1st, we'll have a website up with the full program information, the application for both the graduate, master's, and the certificate. And there'll be a lot of info. We'll also have a brochure you can download there. So if we can hang tight for a little bit, there'll be more information out soon. For the professional certificate, there's already a website up, and hopefully someone can put that in the chat for me, or yes. Anyway, there's a website up that shares, that you can register now, that talks all about what we're doing for that.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Okay. So why don't we thank Jeremy for his great presentation by maybe raising your hand? Okay. So we're going to have more lectures coming up. So the next one is going to be held on February 11th at the same time, which means 12 p.m. The speaker will be Scott Burns, who's an emeritus professor at the PSU's Department of Geology. Then the title of the talk will be Geo-Disaster Resilience, Quakes, Floods, Slides, and More. So if you have questions about what we're gonna do, yes, here's the URL for the lecture series. And also, Jeremy, this lecture will be available online as a video.
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay, so we can just go to the same website?
Yes, so yeah, because we're so new, our website for EMCR, for each faculty member, will have their talk from this series connected to their profile. So come check out the Emergency Management and Community Resilience website February 1st, and you'll have some faculty profiles, and you'll be able to have a link to this talk.
Great. Thank you so much again. Okay, everybody, thank you so much for coming to our first lecture series. We very much appreciate your attendance, and we'll see you again on February 11th. Thank you so much. Have a nice afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.